The Pacific burned itself out slowly, as if reluctant to concede the exhaustion of men. On small volcanic islands, scattered across the empire's edge, the air hung thick with the residue of defeat. The teenagers who had once drilled with bamboo spears in the schoolyards of Nagasaki and Kagoshima now found themselves standing barefoot on American soil, not as invaders, but as prisoners. Their capture was not heroic, nor shameful. It was accidental. The last months of the war had turned even boys into soldiers. Some were naval cadets manning outposts that ceased to exist overnight. Others, conscripted clerks, left behind when communications collapsed. The imperial edicts had promised death before dishonor, yet many had been too young to truly believe in death, or too hungry to refuse survival. When the Americans came, they expected cruelty. The pamphlets circulated by Japanese authorities had painted images of the enemy as barbarians, men who would mutilate, humiliate, and erase their captives. The boys rehearsed suicide with hand grenades or rusted rifles, yet when surrender came, the grenades failed or the courage did. At first, silence ruled their capture. They were taken aboard ships whose decks smelled of oil and soap, guarded not by snarling executioners, but by quiet, efficient men who offered them water. The youngest, barely 16, tried to refuse it, fearing poison, until thirst betrayed resolve. Across the ocean, American camps awaited. These were not the imagined dungeons of imperial propaganda, but orderly grids of fences and barracks, watched over by sentries who smoked cigarettes and listened to swing music. The boys entered the gates expecting death. They found boredom instead. The camps had names: Honouliuli, Fort McCoy, Camp Lordsburg, and each carried its own rhythm of war's aftermath. In the Hawaiian sun, the grass grew tall between barbed wires, and the prisoners were given shovels to tame it. In Wisconsin, snow fell so thickly that the men from Kyushu thought they had entered another planet. In the early weeks, the teenagers, still trembling from capture, moved like ghosts. They ate canned rations with wooden chopsticks fashioned from scrap. They wrote no letters, for there was no one left to write to. Their officers, some barely older, enforced fragments of military discipline, standing at attention for roll call, refusing to speak English, bowing before meals as though ceremony could preserve dignity. But the Americans, for their part, were unprepared for such youth. Many guards had seen combat in the Pacific and expected hardened killers. Instead, they found boys whose uniforms were held together by string. Some could not yet shave. A few cried at night, stifling the sound in their blankets. The American officers debated how to treat them. Enemy combatants or children? Eventually, bureaucracy prevailed. They were logged, numbered, and categorized, each name transliterated awkwardly into English letters. A small act of translation that erased part of who they had been. Yet life inside the camp began to resemble something like survival. The Red Cross visited with parcels. Doctors inoculated them against diseases. Some were given English readers' textbooks, once used by American high schoolers. The irony was bitter. Boys who had been taught to die for the emperor were now being taught to conjugate to be. Still, shame was the heaviest burden. The Japanese concept of giri duty, obligation, lingered like a ghost between the barracks. To have surrendered was to have failed one's ancestors. To live was to carry the proof of cowardice, and yet they continued to wake, eat, and work, day after day, defying both expectation and instruction. By winter, the first letters from home arrived, filtered through censors and translators. Some contained forgiveness, others silence. Parents wrote of ruined towns, of hunger, of a Japan no longer imperial but broken. The boys, reading these letters aloud in the dim barracks light, understood for the first time that they had outlived the world they had fought to defend. The American guards, too, began to change. The longer the war's end settled into routine, the more the line between captor and captive blurred. Some guards taught the boys baseball. Others brought scraps of magazines showing smiling American teenagers, their lives unscarred by war. The prisoners watched those faces with fascination and disbelief, as though glimpsing a parallel universe. And somewhere between ration lines and work details, an uneasy truth began to take shape. The enemy they had been taught to hate was not the monster of wartime myth, but a mirror different only in luck, language, and geography. As spring arrived, the boys planted a small garden behind the laundry shed. Cabbage, onions, a few seeds scavenged from kitchen waste. It was not sanctioned, but neither was it forbidden. Life, stubborn as always, found a way to persist inside fences. By the time the first harvest from the small garden ripened, the rhythm of captivity had become indistinguishable from the rhythm of existence itself. Sunrise, inspection, roll call, labor, mess, dusk. The repetition eroded the sharp edges of fear, polishing the boys into something calmer, almost reflective. The war had receded to the distance of rumor. What remained was the slow architecture of days. The camps were models of bureaucratic geometry, barracks in parallel lines, watchtowers casting long shadows that divided the earth into sections of obedience. Yet even the guards had grown weary of vigilance. They leaned on railings, cigarettes glowing faintly in the evening fog, eyes wandering toward the same horizon as the captives. Both sides, in their own ways, waited for something release, perhaps, or the restoration of a world that no longer existed. Work was the constant. In the morning, the teenage prisoners were divided into crews, some for maintenance, others for agriculture or carpentry. They repaired fences, whitewashed walls, mended uniforms. American overseers supervised without cruelty, bound by manuals that prescribed fairness as a military virtue. The boys followed instructions with the solemn precision once reserved for shrine rituals. In their quiet labor, they found the only redemption available: usefulness. At Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, winter defined everything. The snow came early and refused to leave. The Japanese boys, accustomed to humidity and sea air, learned the texture of frostbite. Their hands cracked, their breath turned visible. And yet there was a strange comfort in the cold. It numbed the ache of memory. The camp issued them wool coats, oversized and faintly scented with mothballs. They looked like children dressed in their father's clothing, caught between adolescence and ruin. Meals became the punctuation marks of the day: canned meat, potatoes, white bread, coffee too bitter to drink. At first they approached the food with suspicion, recalling the wartime fables of poison. But hunger triumphed. By spring, even the most austere of them had acquired a taste for the sweetness of condensed milk. The cooks, mostly German-American civilians, served with mechanical indifference, unaware that every ladle of soup was quietly dismantling the image of the barbaric enemy. Some boys began to learn English through necessity. Words first, then fragments of grammar. Thank you, work, good morning. Language became a fragile bridge across the cultural void. When they mispronounced, the guards laughed, not cruelly, but with the unstudied amusement of people who no longer considered one another threats. A few guards, veterans of Okinawa and Saipan, carried unspoken grief of their own. They had killed men not much older than these prisoners, and now supervised their survival. The irony went unspoken, but it hung heavy in the air, a quiet reconciliation that neither side sought, but both needed. The American Red Cross delivered books, novels, dictionaries, even magazines. The covers were bright, filled with smiling faces and advertisements for automobiles. The boys studied them like sacred texts. What kind of nation could produce such images while the rest of the world starved? The glossy paper smelled faintly of perfume and machine oil, intoxicating and unreal. A few of the older prisoners began sketching in the margins drawings of mountains, home villages, mothers' faces, memory disguised as art. The camp chapel, built hastily from surplus lumber, stood empty most days. Yet on Sundays, a few curious boys entered, sitting silently on the benches while an American chaplain spoke of mercy and renewal. They understood little of the words, but the cadence soothed them. Afterward, they lingered outside, eyes drawn to the simple wooden cross against the sky. It reminded them not of conversion, but of surrender to inevitability, the same surrender they had already performed in another form. Time blurred, the seasons changed, but the fences remained. Letters came less frequently. Japan's defeat had transformed families into survivors. Shame, hunger, and occupation left little room for correspondence. Those who still received mail guarded it like relics. Paper softened by touch, words fading into translucence. One letter described the rebuilding of a school near Hiroshima, where the walls glowed faintly at night. The boy who read it did not know why, but he could not sleep afterward. By 1946, the camps had begun to change their function. The war was over. The machinery of re-education had begun. The Americans saw opportunity where despair once stood. They introduced lectures on democracy, civics, and modern thinking. Translators spoke of freedom as though it were a commodity to be distributed. The teenagers listened in respectful silence, their expressions unreadable. They had been taught from infancy that obedience was virtue. Now they were told that individuality was sacred. It was as if they had been asked to reverse the current of their blood. Some adapted quickly. They mimicked American gestures, smiled when addressed, even practiced baseball with clumsy enthusiasm. Others withdrew further inward, convinced that such lessons were a second defeat, a conquest not of armies but of spirit. Between these extremes lay the majority, uncertain, watchful, surviving one ideology by quietly enduring another. The guards rotated out, replaced by younger men who had never seen combat. To them, the prisoners were merely statistics in a post-war administration. Discipline slackened. The gates were watched, but not feared. Some prisoners wandered near the perimeter to gaze at the distant towns. Through the wire, they could see children riding bicycles, women hanging laundry, radios playing songs they did not understand. Civilization resumed as though war had been only a temporary inconvenience. In the evenings, the camp quieted. The sound of crickets replaced the memory of artillery. The boys gathered outside, gazing at constellations unfamiliar to their hemisphere. They spoke little, for language itself had grown thin from overuse. Silence became the only territory they still owned. Inside that silence, thoughts of home grew sharper, the scent of tatami mats, the warmth of a mother's voice, the hum of cicadas over rice fields now likely reduced to ash. And yet, paradoxically, many began to feel safer in captivity than they had before. The camp provided food, order, predictability, luxuries unknown in the chaos of post-war Japan. Beyond the fences lay uncertainty, within them a fragile equilibrium. To leave would mean returning to a land that no longer resembled memory. To stay was to remain an exile in someone else's peace. When spring came again, the garden bloomed larger than before. The cabbages were greener, the onions sweeter. American officers noticed, praised the efficiency, and recorded it in reports as evidence of good morale. They did not realize that for the Japanese boys, cultivation was not morale, but resurrection, a refusal to disappear entirely. Each plant was an act of remembrance, each harvest a muted apology to the ancestors who had demanded death and received persistence instead. By the time the first orders for repatriation arrived, the boys had aged in invisible ways. Their faces had lost the roundness of youth, their eyes the intensity of faith. They no longer expected miracles, nor feared punishment. They had learned instead the quiet arithmetic of survival. The war had begun with noise and ended in paperwork. Their names, once shouted in training fields, now appeared neatly typed on manifests. Each letter of the alphabet a foreign echo of identity. They would board ships again soon, sailing back across the same ocean that had carried them into captivity. But this time, the direction of the voyage meant something neither victory nor defeat could contain. For the Americans, the departure of the Japanese POWs marked closure. For the boys, it marked the beginning of something more complex, a life lived in the shadow of survival. The camp gates would open, but a part of them would remain behind, woven into the rhythm of that strange mechanical peace they had once feared and learned to inhabit. The ocean that carried them home was vast and indifferent. Steel hulls trembled beneath the waves, their engines thudding like exhausted hearts. The ships bore no flags of triumph, only a weary convoy of ghosts returning from a war that had ended before they truly understood it. The teenage prisoners, now older by seasons rather than years, lined the decks in silence, watching the horizon blur into mist. Behind them lay the ordered geometry of the American camps. Ahead lay the unknown shape of Japan's defeat. Their uniforms were replaced with civilian garments ill-fitting, colorless, donated by the same nation that had once been their captor. Tags on their coats bore English letters, names rendered strange by transliteration. The sea wind carried scents of salt and diesel, mingled with the faint sweetness of liberation that none of them dared to taste. Freedom, after captivity, was an abstraction. They had forgotten its practical weight. As the ships neared Yokohama, a hush fell over the decks. The coastline rose from the fog like a memory reluctantly summoned. What had once been a city of ports and factories now resembled an anatomy of ruin. Warehouses gutted by fire, docks splintered by bombs, cranes twisted into silhouettes against the dawn. American naval vessels patrolled the harbor, their flags flapping with a quiet arrogance that no longer provoked anger, only resignation. Disembarkation was slow. The former POWs were processed, examined, catalogued again, one last ritual of control before release. The occupation authorities recorded every name, every scar, every detail of survival. Reporters watched from a distance, sketching notes on the strange sight of returning soldiers who looked more like orphans than warriors. The teenagers stood barefoot on Japanese soil, unable to decide whether to bow or simply breathe. The air smelled of ash and ferment. The ruins of Tokyo lay only hours away, a labyrinth of broken concrete and half-buried memories. The boys were issued travel passes, a few yen, and thin blankets. No one gave instructions on how to rejoin a nation that no longer existed. The journey inland unfolded through landscapes stripped of certainty. Rice paddies lay fallow, their irrigation channels choked with silt. Villages clustered around makeshift shrines to the dead. The trains, half repaired, rattled through valleys where the smoke of burning still lingered years after surrender. At each station, the boys saw posters bearing the face of the emperor no longer divine, merely symbolic. His voice, once sacred, had already spoken the words of capitulation that ended their world. Homecomings were awkward, quiet affairs. Families received the survivors with a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. The cultural script offered no vocabulary for return. To die had been honorable, to live ambiguous. Mothers wept in private. Fathers looked away. Neighbors whispered. In towns where memorial stones listed the names of the fallen, no space had been left for those who came back alive. Some of the teenagers tried to resume school. They sat among younger students, learning arithmetic beneath roofs patched with tin and paper. The new curriculum spoke of democracy and peace, of cooperation with the same Americans who had once imprisoned them. The irony tasted metallic. When teachers asked them to describe their experiences abroad, they spoke in euphemisms: work camps, study, rehabilitation, never prison. The word carried too much weight, too much misunderstanding. Others turned to labor, seeking to dissolve memory in exhaustion. Reconstruction demanded hands, not questions. They shoveled rubble, mixed concrete, hauled lumber. Cities rose again with astonishing speed, as though Japan sought to rebuild itself before shame could settle. The former prisoners blended into this vast movement of repair, their stories buried beneath the noise of industry. But captivity had altered them in subtle, irreversible ways. They had seen order in the enemy's system, cleanliness in its logic, humanity in its contradictions. They had eaten its food, worn its clothes, read its books. They had lived under the gaze of an occupier who, paradoxically, had taught them survival rather than subjugation. This duality haunted them. In their dreams, fences reappeared, neither hostile nor protective, simply inevitable. In post-war Japan, youth itself became suspect. The generation that had fought was too old to rebuild, and the one that had survived carried invisible stains. The teenage POWs, now in their early 20s, found themselves drifting between worlds, too disillusioned for patriotism, too disciplined for rebellion. The new democracy valued expression. They had been trained in silence. They wrote letters to former guards in stilted English, half to practice the language, half to preserve a connection to the only stability they had known. Some replies arrived, brief, polite, filled with the same uneasy nostalgia. The enemy had become a memory shared by both sides. In the countryside, rumors circulated about American generosity, the food aid, the textbooks, the films. The ex-POWs, when asked, confirmed these stories with a strange detachment. Yes, they said, the Americans fed us. Yes, they treated wounds, allowed gardens, even smiles. The listeners reacted with confusion, sometimes anger. The myth of the monstrous occupier had been a comfort during the hunger years. To dismantle it was to confront the complexity of defeat. Yet the survivors themselves were not immune to bitterness. They had lost more than a war. They had lost the architecture of belief. The emperor was mortal. The army disbanded, the code of honor fractured. Even the notion of Japan had changed shape under occupation. Streets filled with American cars, magazines printed in 2 languages, radio stations played jazz between public announcements. The world the boys returned to no longer recognized them. A few turned to religion, drawn by the quiet universality of forgiveness. Christian missionaries arriving alongside aid shipments offered a vocabulary for rebirth. The former prisoners sat in wooden pews, listening to sermons about sin and grace. Some found solace in the idea that suffering might hold meaning. Others rejected it, sensing only another layer of foreign instruction. But the ritual itself, the gathering, the stillness, echoed the order they once knew behind fences. Years passed, and the camps became memories, then stories, then silence. Official records listed them as minor footnotes in the vast chronicle of war. Historians focused on battles, not aftermaths. Photographs of Japanese POWs in American custody showed rows of faces without names, anonymous in their endurance. The individual lives behind those images dissolved into the collective narrative of reconstruction. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, the memory persisted. In factories and offices, in quiet family dinners, the former captives carried their invisible scars. They flinched at sudden loudspeakers, avoided crowded trains, hesitated before speaking English aloud. Their children, decades later, would ask about the war, and they would answer only that they had worked in America, a convenient simplification. Among them, a few began to write. Not memoirs exactly, but fragments, poems, essays, notebooks filled with careful handwriting. They described the smell of snow in Wisconsin, the taste of canned milk, the way American guards had whistled songs through the night. These writings circulated privately, samizdat of memory, preserving what history preferred to forget. Some reached American Veterans Associations, sparking brief correspondence across the Pacific, letters exchanged between former captors and captives, bound not by ideology, but by the shared loneliness of survival. And so, in the decades that followed, the meaning of captivity shifted. It ceased to be a mark of shame and became, quietly, a lesson. The teenagers who had once trembled before surrender grew into men who understood its paradox, that survival, too, can be an act of courage. By the 1950s, Japan had entered its miraculous recovery. Factories glowed through the night, cities pulsed with neon, and the generation of the defeated found itself swept into modernity. Yet amid the rush of progress, a few still dreamed of the camp garden's rows of onions growing stubbornly in foreign soil. In those dreams the air was clean, the days ordered, the world momentarily comprehensible. The fence was gone, but part of them wished it remained not as imprisonment, but as clarity. Time smoothed the sharp edges of memory, but did not erase them. By the 1960s, the boys who had once stared through American fences were middle-aged men with families, clerical jobs, and the quiet fatigue of those who had lived too much history. Japan was now a partner to its former enemy. The occupation had ended, the treaty signed, the nation reborn under the banner of peace and productivity. Television screens glowed with imported optimism. Yet behind every commercial for automobiles and instant noodles lingered the faint shadow of another era, the one that began in surrender and ended in silence. The former prisoners rarely met, but when they did, the air between them felt charged with an unspoken recognition. They gathered occasionally in community halls or at veterans' memorials, sitting apart from the older soldiers who had fought until the last bullet. They had no medals to display, no tales of glory to trade. Their stories belonged to the gray space between defeat and survival, a territory no anthem celebrated. Some had written small essays for newspapers, cautiously titled Experiences Abroad or Life in the Camp. The editors often softened their language, removing anything that sounded sympathetic toward America. National dignity demanded a delicate balance. Yet within those trimmed sentences lay something profound, the discovery that kindness and cruelty could exist within the same uniform, that humanity could persist even when nations collided. A few Americans remembered them too. In archives and veterans' clubs, faded photographs surfaced. Lines of Japanese teenagers working fields in the Wisconsin snow, smiling awkwardly beside their guards. The captions read simply, "Enemy POWs." To the men who had taken those pictures, they were reminders that war was fought mostly by children pretending to be soldiers. Some of those guards, now grandfathers themselves, wrote to Japanese newspapers when tourism between the two countries increased. They asked if any of the boys remembered them, if they had survived. Letters crossed the Pacific once more, thin, hesitant, written in two languages that still distrusted each other. "I remember the garden," one man wrote from Osaka. "You gave us seeds." The American replied, "I remember your onions. They tasted like home." These small exchanges, invisible to the machinery of diplomacy, carried more reconciliation than any treaty. In the early 1970s, a small television crew from NHK filmed a documentary about wartime prisoners. They found several of the former teenage captives living quiet lives as teachers, farmers, and civil servants. The camera lingered on their faces, lined, restrained, yet luminous, with something that resembled peace. They spoke of hunger, of snow, of the strange gentleness of their captors. One of them described the moment he first tasted coffee in the American camp. "It was bitter. I thought it was punishment. Then I realized it was a beginning." The broadcast aired late at night when most viewers were asleep, but for those who watched, it carried the faint ache of recognition. History, however, moves faster than remembrance. The economic miracle demanded forgetfulness. Factories replaced temples as symbols of faith. School textbooks spoke briefly of the war, then hurried toward the prosperity that followed. The generation born after 1945 regarded stories of captivity as relics, embarrassing, even sentimental. But the survivors continued to remember in silence. For them, the camps had been universities of endurance, classrooms of contradiction. In America, too, memory fragmented. The war became history, then entertainment. Hollywood painted it in colors of heroism and sacrifice. Few films showed the camps where Japanese boys had tended gardens under American watch. The archives slept under dust. Only historians and aging veterans recalled the detail that not every prisoner was a fanatic, and not every captor was cruel. By the 1980s, the survivors' hair had turned gray. They traveled occasionally to Hawaii, to California, on cultural exchanges sponsored by reconciliation groups. At airports, they walked through crowds of tourists, unaware that these quiet men had once crossed the same ocean in chains. In Honolulu, one visited the site of Honouliuli Camp, now overgrown with vines and silence. He found the remnants of a foundation, a few rusted nails, the ghost of a fence post. Standing there, he realized that what he sought was not the past itself, but the proof that it had happened. He knelt, touched the soil, and felt a strange gratitude. The land that had confined him had also preserved him. Beneath his fingertips, the earth was warm. Others never left Japan again. They watched the world modernize from the periphery, their memories gradually dissolving into domestic routines, children's school fees, the price of rice, the hum of neon signs. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, a smell or a sound would call them back. The hiss of a train's brakes became the memory of steam rising from a Wisconsin morning. The crack of a baseball bat echoed the thud of a guard's footsteps on gravel. The ordinary world was filled with tiny portals to captivity. They did not resent these reminders. They carried them as one might carry an old scar tender but instructive. When their children asked what they had learned in America, they answered carefully that enemies are made by orders, not by faces. In 1991, one of the survivors, by then a retired schoolteacher, published a memoir privately. Only a few hundred copies were printed. It was titled Between Fences. The prose was spare, the tone measured. He described not the battles, but the silences, the routines, the sound of rain on tin roofs. "We were told to die," he wrote, "but instead we learned how to live slowly. The book circulated quietly among universities and peace foundations, later translated into English by a professor who had once studied in the United States. When it reached an American library, a veteran recognized a name, wrote a letter, and the two men, once guard and prisoner, met in person half a century later. Their meeting took place in a park near San Francisco Bay. No cameras, no officials. They sat on a bench, watching the water move under sunlight. They spoke little. What could be said that time had not already translated? At the end, they exchanged small gifts, a packet of Japanese tea, a baseball from 1945, two relics of survival. Then they bowed to each other, not as enemies, not even as friends, but as witnesses to the same unfinished story. The years carried them both into obscurity. The camps themselves vanished, dismantled, repurposed, forgotten. Grass covered the foundations, children played where barbed wire once hummed in the wind. Yet memory has its own geography, impervious to maps. It lives in the pauses between history books, in the glances of those who refuse to forget. Now, in the 21st century, the story of the teenage POWs exists mostly in archives and footnotes. Their faces stare out from black and white photographs, eyes calm, expressions unreadable. Tourists visiting museum exhibits linger briefly, then move on. But if one listens closely, beneath the glass and dust, there is still a whisper. The sound of a young man breathing in the alien scent of freedom for the first time, somewhere behind a fence in America. The war that made them prisoners is long gone, yet its echo remains, not in speeches or monuments, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary lives. Each survivor carried the contradiction forward that mercy can emerge from conquest, that dignity can survive humiliation. In this way, the story does not end. It drifts across the Pacific like a tide that refuses final rest, touching shores on both sides, reshaping what nations remember about themselves. The American camps, once symbols of control, have become reminders of shared humanity. The Japanese boys who entered them expecting death found instead the slow, bewildering task of learning how to live. And somewhere, perhaps in an attic in Osaka or a forgotten archive in Wisconsin, a photograph still exists. A handful of teenagers kneeling beside a patch of onions, smiling at the camera, the fence behind them blurring into sunlight. The caption is missing, the names erased by time. Yet the image endures, a fragment of history's quiet mercy, suspended between enemies who no longer exist, in a world still learning the fragile art of forgiveness.